Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. Thank you for joining for another panel. Very excited about this one, about contextualizing Agile for marketing operations. So when, translating the approach and the rigor of Agile from the tech and software development world into pharmaceutical commercial operations has really been a hot topic in our industry for the last year or so. And I'm very excited to discuss it with a distinguished panel that each panelist has actually deep expertise and background on the technology side and on the commercial operations side, both. So my panel today joining me is Jeff French, who's VP and CDO at Viv Health, Lisa Tolman, Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at Echo, Brian Cantwell, VP Digital Strategy and Operations at Bayer, and Chad Lacrosse, VP of US Commercial Brand and Commercial Operations, BTS at AbbVie. Hello, thank you again joining me. Let's start off with a question for Chad. Chad, why is Agile marketing operations such an important topic at AbbVie? And what are the possibilities that it opens up for marketing that wouldn't be possible without Agile?
Thank you, Mark. And before I answer the question, I just want to thank you and Indegene for the opportunity to interact with this distinguished group, and I hope that the people attending find this extremely interesting. I know I will, getting to hear from the expertise of this distinguished panel members. So back to the question, I think that I've read some research recently that COVID itself has accelerated the digital adoption across industries by almost 7 years. And when you think about that in the healthcare space, and you think about the other changes that have happened as a result of COVID, stakeholder expectations essentially changed overnight, and needs are evolving in the marketplace that that companies like AbbVie need to react to and need to change. I think the other thing is that doctors, potential patients, and patients are consumers, and they're getting used to, and their expectations for personalization and information that's relevant to them is continuing to increase. So as the industries outside of life sciences evolve, those expectations are being reflected back on the life sciences industry as well. And it takes resources in order to be able to produce content that can meet the needs of those expectations and different people who are in different places of their journey. That costs money. And so working in traditional ways, it's really unaffordable to be able to deliver on the expectations and the needs of personalization of these different stakeholders. And so I equate personalization and cost effectiveness to being able to go faster, because time is money. And that means being more agile in the way that you work. So I think that these new kinds of operating models are paramount for marketing teams to be able to meet the expectations at the speed of business, the speed of digital, at a price point that's something that they can manage within their existing marketing budgets.
Very good. And Chad, when you say agile, it's not just being flexible or being more faster and dynamic, but really applying the rigorous principles and techniques of agile into the operations as a solution. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Mark. If you think about ways of working, if you put yourself in a situation of a product launch or an unplanned label update or an event like COVID, unless you change your behavior, your ways of working, and really adopt a lot of the big A agile types of principles, it's going to feel like you're working in an emergency. But our objective is how to take what feels like working in an emergency and make that the way of working as a new standard. And unless you change, right, you can't just through brute force and through working extra hours and across weekends, you can't sustain that for perpetuity. And so this is really a new paradigm. And to be successful in that new paradigm means adopting a different way of working.
Lisa, thank you. Lisa, you have experience in Agile from a perspective of customer centricity and marketing ops. And I know you have a framework you want to share with us. What have you learned?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Mark. And I would echo what Chad said. Just it's always a privilege to be engaged with the forward thinkers both at Indegene and the folks that you engage with. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be a part of this. I appreciate the way that Chad has set things up just in so talking about Agile. And what we, at my heart, it's what we really need to challenge ourselves is to think deeply about how and where to best leverage Agile. And guided really by the why, which captures the substantial opportunity. So he spoke about it in the context of content. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, just speaking a bit about the ways in which I've seen it be leveraged valuably, either Agile or Agile principles. I think we find that Agile has a way of weaving itself into the conversation in a lot of different ways. And I was listening yesterday to Diana McKenzie's keynote on the topic of opportunities inspired by the digital world. And she mentioned Agile as a way to better enable how we serve patients, which is really key, right? It's this customer centricity element. So she mentioned how it can help us go faster, to be smarter and be more customer centric. Even though we're in a regulated healthcare environment, I certainly believe that those things are achievable. And it also summarizes well my experience in learning. And as you mentioned, this is really developed from the work that I've done related to customer centricity, and then also through marketing operations and innovation. So before I get into those slides, which hopefully will help solidify a little of how I'm thinking about it, I wanted to just share a few more thoughts about Agile in general, which I think helps brings it to life. Because it really is important when considering an Agile journey, at least in my mind, is to key in on what the organization is trying to achieve and what you're trying to achieve, and then the support that Agile offers to get there. Because there isn't necessarily one rigid way to implement it, I don't believe. So our life sciences why is to deliver better outcomes for patients. And I think it's without exception that the mission and vision of pretty much every life science company I've seen is centered on making life better for patients. And hopefully everybody can relate to that that's on this call, and we're all nodding vigorously. But to support this, typically better outcomes can be delivered when organizations shift in a few key ways. And all of these are fundamental Agile principles. So, for the folks that are listening, these are just thoughts on quite specific things that one needs to have in mind as a backdrop. So I'll highlight 4 key elements. The first is, and I do believe this is not, brand new. It's not that this journey hasn't started, but we really do need to move from a product focus, where we centered on talking about what we have, to solution focus, grounded in customer needs. And to be clear here, I see customers all of patient, healthcare provider, and payer. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit. Also from long development cycles where we typically try to get things right the first time, so it's a perfection, more to this iterative test, learn, incorporate approach where we focused on continuous learning. So these are all just fundamental backdrops to what Agile principles are and what it enables. Then from our functional silos, and I see less and less siloed activity in terms of people collaborating well, but I think we still define and develop things very often in the silos before we collaborate. So the idea is to have better integrated cross-functional teams. And then I think we all find ourselves chasing so many things that look valuable. So it's the simultaneous chasing of looking what's valuable, and rather just really be focused on what's important now. So I mentioned earlier that I would share, I think, 2 different ways that I've seen successful implementation of Agile and Agile principles. So the first approach is much more general at the organization level, and it relates to leveraging Agile principles. So this is not necessarily having a core team operating in full Agile mode, although there might be one within that. So the key opportunity in this example is to ensure that different organizational lenses or functions and experience are taken into account, along with the ongoing learning of individual team members. And at the core, we've got to keep the customer particularly close. So this is then used to influence direction, which must be agreed across teams and levels and then broadly communicated so that everyone is singing from the same song sheet. So this is probably a good time to bring up a slide to make it a little less abstract. So let's take a look at the slide. Great. So what this slide shows are the key steps that an organization can implement on a regular basis for great benefit. And while this is a linear representation, we see the virtuous cycle created by the arrows, which is really a critical element of the approach. So it's iterative. So just to remember, again, this is just at the organizational level. And I'll talk briefly about each box. So the first one, the insights gathering, understanding customer needs. So, particularly with digital tools that are available today, I think that we sometimes feel that we can understand customer needs just from analysis and artificial intelligence and so on, and secondary research. The emphasis here is that that's really important, but it doesn't come from the research team alone, but any informative interaction. So sales teams, for example, are interacting with healthcare providers all the time, and I could list a bunch of other examples. So in this particular box over here represented, this particular step, it's about bringing it all together. And these insights on a regular basis, so I'm thinking, maybe monthly, if there's something significant that happens more frequently, that's good. If it's less frequent because the brand is very well established, then so be it. But these insights then inform what comes next and need to be incorporated in what comes next, which brings us to the second box over there. That you see, which is around insight synthesis and prioritizing customer needs and defining focus. So again, we can't do everything. We really need to be clear on what it is that we want to focus on most now, which is going to deliver what customers need mostly, as well as one has to take into account the organization's ability to deliver and the impact to the organization of doing so. And what's critical here is that these must be agreed across functions and levels. And, through having the right people in the right meetings, it can be done relatively easily and quickly, because it doesn't have to be perfect, but it does have to be in the right direction, with the goal being to move through, test and learn, etc. So once you've prioritized the customer needs and defined the focus, it takes us to the third box over here, which is around insights assimilation. So plans and activities are already underway, unless it's a brand new product with a brand launch. So how this is integrated is key. And the result will be that you'll refine your existing actions or define new ways. And then looking at box 4 over there, we know that implementation success is predicated on the team that needs to execute being fully aware and on board. So the communication piece with a consistent narrative is really critical. And one should plan this communication, disseminate the agreed plan across functions in a consistent and compelling way. That's really important. And it all gets brought home again with the right analytics and measurement, and that feeds into insights gathering. So it all comes together, and so the cycle continues. And that's it, easy. I realize it's a bit of a whirlwind, and sometimes when I'm talking through this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Monty Python. I know that it's some time ago, but John Cleese and the Monty Python team do a whole How to Do It series that covers numerous topics. But anyway, and the one that I'm thinking of, he's teaching children how to play the flute, and he brings up a flute and he points at the one end and he says, you simply blow in one end, and then he points to the other and he says, you move your fingers up and down the outside, and then he puts the flute down, and people are supposed to be able to play the flute. So in reality, Agile implementation requires a changed mindset and significant effort. And then I think the leadership commitment shouldn't be underplayed here, because you need that commitment and support to try it out and to get it right. So that's leveraging of Agile principles. The second opportunity that I'd like to talk about relates to deploying an Agile team. So this is a team that's dedicated to operating an Agile focused on specific things. So there's much literature on the hazards of multitasking, notwithstanding that I imagine that many of you might be doing it right now. But monotasking really enables one to move faster and more effectively. So a team that's fully deployed as an Agile team really facilitates this monotasking, where you have a backlog of areas to work on, but you've prioritized that backlog so it's clear what the singular next focus should be. And so this second slide provides some visual representation on how to think of the team and the players focused on a particular opportunity. And the example that I'll use, or at least where I have most experience, is where the team is focused on a clear understanding of customer needs. And, we speak about this often. If we're trying to be relevant and personal, and, Chad was talking about this early on, we really do have to understand these needs. So I know that the slide has a lot of functions listed. Its intention is to show how important it is to have cross-functional representation, even though not every one of these functions necessarily are represented on every Agile team. So the key structural elements are represented in the black text in the middle and at the side, starting with consideration for who are the key stakeholders for this body of work. And, specifically, who should be on the core team. So research suggests that teams of about 5 to 9 people work best. And in my experience, the best teams are when the core team, is chosen by a relevant skill set and the likelihood to succeed operating in this manner. With this mandate. So Agile, cross-functional, or at least can adopt it. They don't have to know it in advance. Then the question becomes, who should be on the extended team? And these are folks who don't necessarily all sit together working in Agile all the time, but they can be pulled in as subject matter experts or key players. And it's important to think through who these folks will be because they have relevant insight. They might be decision makers, or they may be people who need to adopt the output from the team. And so it's so critical that they have some measure of engagement. Then, with that engagement, they're able to share their thoughts and influence, and whatever those ultimate outputs are for the objectives to be accomplished, they'll be more willing and likely to adopt them. So finally, on the right-hand side, you see those 2 boxes talking to the product owner and the Scrum Master. These are just important roles to help the Agile team function seamlessly. The product owner would be the overall team coordinator and decision maker, bringing everything together. This is not the manager of the Agile team, so to speak. At least it hasn't been in my experience and doesn't need to be. Although they do have the decision-making authority for this Agile team. And then the Scrum Master, who's really the process owner, who facilitates the effectiveness of the team. And both of these roles aren't necessarily 100% roles. They're roles, they could be combined with other roles, so they form part of the core team. Anyway, Mark, I've been speaking a long time. This is really the whirlwind of what incorporating Agile can look like as I see it, which I hope provides some framework on how to think about the opportunity to leverage Agile and Agile principles in 2 different ways. And with that, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a very fairly complete overview on what Agile from an operation perspective means. Now, Brian, you have real-world experience running multiple pilots, fairly extensive pilots in your organization. So what does this theory look like when it actually becomes practice and a rubber hits the road?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. And just to echo my colleagues, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this panel and put me on the same virtual stage as some digital luminaries here among Lisa, Jeff, and Chad. So appreciate the opportunity. But actually, Lisa, I was kind of almost chuckling as I was looking at her second slide in particular, because it could have come from one of our presentations, because that's exactly the type of real world pilots that we've been doing, is actually structuring one of those Agile teams around one of our brands, one of our marketing teams, bringing the right cross-functional support across digital, analytics, field, and our LMR colleagues to the table, and operating with an Agile sprint methodology. And I would say that the hypothesis behind it was, in much to what Lisa was started her presentation talking about, is how do we turn customer insight into customer outcome faster? And I think that the thesis behind it is we kind of need to disrupt our annual process. Pharma's process traditionally is very annual, right? We start with insights, market situations, things of that nature. Then go into kind of the customer specific insights, archetypes, segments, et cetera. Then we come up with strategic imperatives, and then we come up with activation plans, go through a planning phase, come up with activation plans against those imperatives. And then those activation plans get turned into creative briefs, and we brief in AORs, and they go off and design a bunch of content and tactics and whatnot. And then we have to execute those tactics in the market. And that process, for the most part, takes takes the full calendar year. And if the pharmas that maybe have a little bit more market responsiveness, maybe they're iterating on quarterly business cycles. They're seeing, hey, has the situation changed? Are there new insights? And they're making adjustments. And I think what's disruptive about applying an agile model in a marketing context is it doesn't mean you're not going to do that annual planning process. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have quarterly business reviews where you understand the state of your brand in the marketplace. But what it creates is another cycle, a 2 to 3 week sprint cycle that allows you to go through those same steps, a very fast strategic step. Are we on track? A very fast insight collection step. What's working, what's not working? And then over the 2 to 3 weeks, really turn the wheel and say, can we execute things differently to drive a better customer impact based on those insights? So we're actually implementing this across a number of brand teams. And we're starting to see the impact of this model in the ability to translate customer insight into impact faster. And I think where it has the biggest amount of impact is in enabling more of that test and learn mentality. It's really hard to test and learn as a part of an annual plan where you say, okay, we're going to have some big 6-month-long test where we have to create 2 big sets of campaign assets or whatever it might be. And then it's a year before you have the output of that test. Right? What this does, it says we can go and execute very quickly 2 very simple tactical tests. And within a couple of weeks, we're going to end up with the results back of what worked, what didn't work. And then we can double down on what worked. So the way I describe it, and Chad, what you said around kind of the emergency mentality really resonated with me, because I think of this as the traditional pharma model on that annual process is the kitchen sink model. It's we're going to do everything. So you got your whole annual plan and you're going to go tackle it and you're going to make very slow incremental progress against everything in your plan all at the same time until a label update comes through or the market situation changes. And then what do you get? You get Chad's emergency situation, right? And so that's the kind of the traditional process, the kitchen sink model. I think what Agile gives you is what I'll call the flashlight model. You shine a light specifically on the customer insight and the set of activities that you're going to do over the next 2 to 3 weeks that's going to drive impact. You have relentless focus on it, you execute it, you see the results of it, and you move on, you move the flashlight, and you focus on the next chunk. So that's where we're starting to see the rubber hit the road in actually driving focus and impact from bringing those Agile teams and Agile models to life with our brand colleagues and cross-functional stakeholders.
Thank you, Brian. So there's a lot of promise in here. Actually, you hear a lot of promise and excitement in this way of working and the benefits. On the other hand, our industry has been working for years in building large efficiency, global scale kind of approaches for much of the commercial challenges, right? Whether it's content or campaign planning, global to local strategy. Jeff, how do you balance the efficiency and scale from these standardized global operations with the benefits or the working ways of Agile that provides this speed and flexibility?
It's a good shout, Mark, and again, echo everybody's point about being on this great group to talk about this subject, because it is an interesting one. I think we're all grappling with this a little bit as we speak, and this specific issue that you're talking about kind of relates to that annual cycle, primarily to what Brian was just chatting about. And if you think about it, there's competing objectives still, even in the annual cycle, as it relates to large brand teams creating standardized content, trying to leverage efficiency across the board as best they can, and trying to drive that consistency of message, but also utilization all the way down into the market. Then you got the market being tasked with, oh, by the way, do what you have to do to create value in your market. Oh, by the way, we just want you to use our stuff. And this is where Brian's point around shining a flashlight for focusing on the things that are going to really make a difference, focusing on the learning, actually is imperative from an Agile perspective to really focus that problem statement. I think Lisa called it the product owner. I think it's that role that I think people are really struggling with in our industry. Where should that sit? Because some people believe that if you're applying true Agile principles, that can sit above the market. I think other people are saying, no, realistically, it's got to be in market, because that's where it's closest to the problem, and that's where you're going to find the solution. And so there's a bit of a battle around that competing objective element, then that's actually compounded by the expectation or the, not the expectation, wrong word, but the necessity to create an agile team around the spotlight, around this specific problem, because that means you got to get all the leadership that's associated with that team that's associated for finding that problem and figuring out to find a solution for it. They all have to be aligned to going after it in a new and unique and much faster pace, like Chad was saying. So it's a real issue, because I think people, they like that standard flow because it has them into a nice rhythm, and they're comfortable and they can plan their financials accordingly. And we all manage really well to our budgets and all that kind of fun stuff. But when you actually need to focus to find that differentiator that's going to leapfrog you in the marketplace, it's all hands on deck, and everybody has to kind of stop what they're doing, focus on the problem at hand, find a new solution. That means leaders of those organizations have to be aligned to allow that to happen. And if you're like most organizations, especially global enterprise organizations, something as simple, I'm going to pick on tech here for a little bit because I used to be part of it. When you have that kind of agile problem that people need to focus on, what happens typically is somebody's got to log a ticket. And that goes back to so all of a sudden the agile model breaks, right? Because you don't have the right people in the room, you haven't thought through it. And it's, how do we change that mindset? How do we change the leadership mindset to allow these people to break away from that management model of efficiency, to go focus on the problem, to kind of sequester that team to make it an outcome that's actually going to be differentiating. So that to me is the big issue. And honestly, I don't think we've cracked that nut. I don't think we have. I think in market, it's actually easier to crack. I think as an enterprise, as an organization at large, I think we're still battling with those competing objectives a bit.
So thank you, Jeff. A few questions arise from what you said. One is actually an audience question addressed to Brian, but many of you can probably answer that. And Jeff, you asked the question yourself. How do you create leadership buy-in to really commit to that kind of work? And Brian, you're doing pilots, you might be scaling this. Did it come from leadership? Did you convince leadership? And please, Chad, everybody else chime in on this question as well.
Yeah, it's actually, I've only been at Bear for about 14 months now. Leadership's commitment to this vision and this transformation is one of the things that attracted me to joining Bear, because this is, I think, a tremendous level of ambition and commitment to moving to an agile operating model across our marketing teams, moving to a priority of digital, where digital is not just the flavor of the month. Digital is an embedded set of differentiated capabilities, where analytics is at the core of how we make decisions. And I think that that's been and to Jeff's point, I think the global local dynamics are also really interesting and crucial to, they can either be an enabler or they can be a significant barrier to this type of transformation. And I would say in our experience, there's tremendous support both at the global and at the local leadership level to this type of transformation. And then the nuances are, which components of the transformation are driven at which level. And that's where I would agree with Jeff and say that I think that so much has to happen at the local, or at least at the regional level, in order to bring this to life, because a globally operated agile team is not going to operate at the level of customer relevance that is required to drive the type of customer impact that we're seeking to drive with these models.
And if I can add something there, but Brian, how do you feel about, because in some models, global's required to be part of the solution, right? Because let's say, for example, you've got a global content capability that's centrally managed and centrally serviced. They got to be part of that team suddenly. So how do you convince the partner functions to say, yeah, we got to go after this problem. I need one of your folks. I know it's not in your plan, but I need one of those people to fix this problem. And I think that's where it's a real interesting dynamic that getting the leadership to say, when that happens, you've got it, right? And I think that's absolutely crucial.
And I won't pretend that we have all the answers. I would say that global was an important part of the solution here, in the sense that global was really driving from an executive committee level the fact that we needed to embark on an agile transformation globally across all of our priority markets, all of our priority products, right? But the only way that was going to stick in the US market, where I'm responsible for digital, is if we made it our own. if we made the model work for our local marketing teams, our local cross-functional teams, and for our local customers. And so, yes, there was a huge role that global played to kind of kickstart this transformation across the entire enterprise. But then we needed to understand it. We needed to make it our own. We needed to take ownership to drive locally the actually enduring transformation. And then I would say that on an ongoing basis, there are still benefits of economies of scale from partnering with global to have common vendors, common technology platforms. But you need all of those platforms and capabilities to be able to operate at a speed that satisfies the local market and the local customer need. And I think that's only possible with local or regional service models as opposed to global one-size-fits-all ticketing queues.
If I could build on.
Thanks, Mark. And
Yeah,
sorry, Chad. Yeah, no, so it sparks a couple of thoughts, and so Chad, write down so you don't forget. But Brian, the first is I think that we're probably going to be watching you a little bit just to see how this goes. But I think that the thoughts that are sparked for me are both around the leadership realm and then the types of things that Agile teams are deployed around. So just everything, or there's certain things where it makes more sense than others. So just maybe just to touch on the leadership element of it, I think it's almost impossible without leadership sponsorship and commitment. And when it's not at the very top, can it be driven at more of a regional top or local level? Again, I think it depends. That brings us to what is it that you're particularly focused on? So if it's a commercial team that is focused on understanding customer need and leveraging that understanding to influence their plans, then I think it can be done. But when one's trying to make that a bit broader, and Jeff used the great example, what if there's a requirement to implement something that needs an IS resource, and well, maybe, and I don't know that IS is a good example because maybe they more typically are operating in Agile, but how do those things get prioritized when there are a number of teams that are operating who might need activity? So I was just curious, Brian, maybe, sorry to punt the question back to you, but how do you think about what are the activities where maybe Agile is the most valuable approach and somewhere it's not, because I don't think everything operates optimally using Agile. And then the question becomes, how do they cross over?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa, and one that we're trying to take this whole test and learn mentality and bring it into how we're piloting these Agile teams as well. So we're going into it knowing we don't have all the answers and wanting to see what works well in this model and what doesn't. My hypothesis, which thus far I think is proved out in a couple situations with a few of our pilots, is that the creation of brand new campaigns or the refreshing of campaigns, the creation of master marketing assets, it doesn't fit perfectly into this model, right? Those are things that it makes sense to have your annual plan and say, we're going to go do the market research and we're going to go craft the new, master campaign assets and go through the traditional process with our AOR and execute that kind of on the timeline that it requires, which is more linear. And usually those are the campaigns too, where you're going to have more sticking points with your LMR colleagues, and you're going to need to kind of negotiate what are the claims we can make and what's appropriate here. But when it comes to taking, whether it's a detail aid, whether it's a website, whatever tactic channel you want to pick, right? When it comes to translating that into, hey, we've got a specific customer insight for this customer segment, and we need to drive a level of improved awareness or improved engagement on these key messages in this period of time, and we think we could do it this way or that way. Executing that test within a 3-week sprint, right? Which may require building a landing page on your existing website, adding something to your detail aid. It may require a level of analysis to do a sub-segmentation or micro-segmentation. Those are the things that we see really fitting well into the Agile team model. And then it becomes more of an awareness of inputs and outputs. Do you have the inputs you need to that sprint in order to execute in an iterative fashion on the tests that you want to run, right? So if you're waiting on a whole bunch of new master creative assets, then you're not ready to execute the next sprint and test those things. So you should focus a sprint on what you have available to then go execute a test. So that's how we're starting to think about it and kind of what goes into the agile model versus what still operates a bit linearly. And I think it's not about replacing the annual cycle with the iterative sprint cycle. It's about concentric circles coexisting with each other.
Completely agree, Brian. We're seeing the exact same kind of situation play out at AbbVie. And kind of coming back to the original question around leadership buy-in, I absolutely agree with the comments here that this is not something that can be driven on a bottoms-up basis. If you just think back to the picture that Lisa was showing earlier, and you see the number of different colors representing the different functions that are implicated by that, getting that buy-in across those functions to work in a different non-shared services kind of way is critical in order for the sustained success. And I think that that means that anyone who's contemplating this really has to work hard to convince the cross-functional leadership that it's the right thing to do. And Brian mentioned a very important word, which is pilots, right? Because no executive in their right mind is going to sign up for a change that's this significant without being able to guarantee that they're going to get some kind of outcome. And I think that there are 3 value levers that people can start to consider when they're building that business case for their leadership to consider. And one of those is where this kind of model can save cost. Second is through deeper customer engagement, through deeper customer understanding, you can create greater customer engagement, which is going to lead to better patient outcomes. It's going to lead to better topside numbers as well for the company. And I think the third one is, from a cultural employee work-life balance standpoint, if you can get to a point with an agreed upon set of priorities and stop working in such a firefighting kind of way, people are actually going to be more engaged in what they're working on. And so I think all 3 of those value drivers, but again, proving that to your leadership sometimes requires doing it in a pilot mode. A lot of times it requires that, and being able to measure the impact of that and using that to predict how it might turn out in terms of scale.
So if I can build on that, Chad, what impact does have working like this on marketing teams and other commercial functions? Like, how does it change the way that how does it impact them over how they're operating today?
Yeah, I believe that this is one of the biggest change management challenges that we face. Changing the way you work. As an IT guy, it's maybe second to changing the productivity tools that people like to get used to working with, which is also another like career limiting move if you ever get involved in that. But to me, going from this annual cycle based process, sort of linear approach, to an iterative approach, there's so many institutionalized systems, processes, reward mechanisms that ultimately change. Fundamentally, the way that you plan and budget, how you manage performance of people who are allocated to teams. You think about shared services. I completely agree with what Jeff was talking about. We're having to tear apart our shared services, which were designed to do things in a very efficient way for a silo, for a particular function, and re-architect those to having dedicated resources. When you think about, there's a lot of coordinators involved in the annual cyclical process, whether it's coordinators within IT, coordinators within marketing, coordinators within marketing ops, coordinators within agencies. And when you shift to these pod models, you're shifting, or these agile models, you're shifting away from the use of coordinators to more doers. And that changes job descriptions, it changes roles and responsibilities, it changes the talent mix. So there's so much change, whether it's to marketing, whether it's to marketing ops, whether it's to medical, regulatory, IT, all of the functions that are reorienting themselves to this sort of agile module are implicated by it. And working through that change and helping people to understand what that means. The transition is as hard as anything.
Jeff, I was going to point to you. How big do you think is the gap between how we need to be structured to operate in Agile versus what the structure is today? Is that bridgeable? Can you evolve into that?
I think Brian's going to tell us at some point when he gets his pilots finished. But In the other bit I wanted to build on real quick, and then I'll jump to that because it actually relates. I think the other big thing that we got to really concentrate on here is the skill piece that Chad was mentioning, because it's a different mentality, but it's also a different skill set that you have to have than probably what's sitting in your organization today across those various different functions. Because it's got to be people who work collectively as part of a norm, but not collectively within a function, but collectively across functions, that people want to understand what tech has to do, want to understand what the data and insight team are learning, they have to be curious, but they have to be well organized, right? And to be able to really focus the energy on the problem that's trying to be solved. And I'm going to go, and I know I said this before, I'm going to go back to Lisa's picture where they had that product owner role. That role is somebody who's really broad and really deep in their subject matter expertise. And they're hard to find, right? It's a needle in a haystack. And so you got to build this agility model around individuals that are able to take that accountability on. And that's where I think, to Brian's point and how they're tackling it within the market, you got to find that person who can do that, who can drive it, and can, especially at the early stages, they're not only solving the problem, they're also probably doing a lot of the change management, doing a lot of the process development at the same time. And so they got to champion the construct. So that's where I think the big divide is at the moment. I do believe it's a combination of the leadership and the ability to literally separate these individuals out so that this works, but also those individuals themselves and finding the right ones. Because there's just, as you guys know, there's so many people in the organization that annual cycle, they really, really flourish in the depth of understanding of a customer, and they want to really dig deep, and they want to spend time and research on really trying to play out what the campaign or the promotional activity might become. And that takes time. That's where somebody has to kind of build up, and people really relish in those environments where you got the high speed, fast pace, lots of coordination, all that kind of stuff. That's a totally different skill set. To Chad's point, it's important that you put the right people in the right place. So it's a combination of the leadership and getting the right people. We got a ways to go.
Ryan, how do people react in doing these pilots? Do you see some of the things that Jeff and Chad are describing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our organizations are not set up to support these types of teams. And that's why we're doing pilots to kind of test out what are the right roles. Lisa mentioned 5 to 8, or 5 to 9 people is kind of the optimal size for this. I've also heard it described, and this may have been attributed accurately or misattributed to Jeff Bezos, but like the number of people you can feed with two large pizzas is the amount of people that can productively operate in an agile team, right? So what is that? I don't know. I eat a lot of pizza, so my team would have to be smaller, but yeah, around that like 8, 9, 10. That's kind of where we're feeling it out. But like, what needs to be at the table? And maybe it's I don't know if it's controversial or not, but that point around the product owner, right? I don't think that product owner can be an IT person. I don't think that product owner can be a global resource. I think that product owner has to be someone who is responsible for making decisions on behalf of the brand team that agile group is serving. So that's how we're thinking about it. Now, but those are also the people in our organizations that are least familiar with an agile model and need the most change management support to really help them understand the model, help them be advocates and champions of the model. And so that's what we're in the midst of working through. And I think that, to me, there's kind of 3 key things that I think about that are required almost as like prerequisites to even get some pilots off the ground and in this model. And I think number 1 is just convincing people that this is not an add-on project, but it's a reorganization of how work gets done. So that would be point number 1, because we've seen this with our own pilots. We've seen a pilot come in, all right, we're going to pilot with this brand team, the agile model. And they're like, okay, well, we're going to pick these 2 things that we weren't going to do anyway, but we're going to create 2 new things, and the agile team's going to focus on those. But then everyone still has to do their day job, right? Well, of everything else in the plan. And that doesn't work, because then you're just basically asking people to add additional hours into their day to focus on the 2 things that you're going to pilot agile with. So what you need to do is think about, how do we take almost the entirety of a brand plan, right, and work it into an agile model, especially from like an iterative campaigning perspective, right? And how do we think about those concentric circles in terms of what's happening within the agile working group and what's happening outside of the agile working group, creating outputs that can become inputs to the agile working group. So I think that's point number one. Point number two, and this is at the heart of our digital transformation, is I believe you need to have differentiated in-house digital capabilities in order to execute on this model. I do not believe that you can execute on this model by asking your AOR to be a part of your agile working group. They are not, their business models do not support having resources that are your dedicated resources within an agile working group. Maybe you will find the odd agency out there that can support that model. But in my experience, they're few and far between. And even if they do, you're going to pay a premium for that type of support. So I think that you need, to the point made, you need doers, right, in this agile working team. And I think that building the right type of in-house talent, and for us, that cuts across strategy to then how you execute that strategy, which is through your operations and through your media. And then you need to have the right creative talent to be able to iterate on things. That's a different type of creative talent than your strategic AOR that's coming up with brand new concept campaigns and creative, right? But you need to have the person who can write the copy for the email that is a part of your agile test, the person who can create the 3 or 4 different versions of a banner ad that's going to be a part of one of your agile tests, et cetera. Like, and so that needs to be in-house talent, or at least operate in a fully dedicated model. And then the last piece is all those things need to come together in a co-creation setting. And I think where that shows up the most is with LMR. I think we've looked at LMR from a, like, what's the minimum number of regulatory partners we need to be able to effectively operate? And what we should be thinking is, how do we co-create with regulatory so things get approved in real time? Right. And that's, I think, a mindset shift for organizations when we talk about the types of resourcing structures we need to support an agile model. You need to have a dedicated regulatory person, potentially a dedicated legal person, potentially a dedicated medical person to your agile working group, so that they can literally respond in real time and co-create the tactics, the experiments, the tests with you, and then approve them as you go.
Wow. I mean, if that doesn't show you the extent of the disruptiveness, really, you basically have to blow some things up and rebuild them, and not just slowly evolve over. So I don't think there's a gradual way to approach this. Lisa, if you have, and by the way, I'm working some audience questions into our discussion here, so I hope the audience keeps asking questions. I just was allowed to run over by a few minutes, which is great. So Lisa, if you have multiple agile teams, how do you set them up to operate concurrently? Because it sounds like that's what will have to happen, right?
Yeah, no, and I mean, these themes that are being hit on really highlight the opportunity as well as the challenges. Whether it's, you know, the change management that Chad is talking about, the leadership. I mean, I think everything that Jeff and Brian and Chad have spoken about, which relates then to what happens when you have multiple teams. So, you know, let's fast forward and say, we have a pilot that's been focused on, and Brian, I would offer, I think this is exactly where we were heading, is that these teams need to be focused on the highest priorities, not on, you know, a sub priority. So you have a team that has demonstrated it is cross-functional, it's demonstrated how it can operate, leveraging Agile, how it's moving faster, and even, you know, just more customer-centric, focused on the right things. And you have multiple of these, where they're operating each as autonomous teams, with the product owner having that ability to work cross-functionally, but also potentially having the deep skill. So, you know, T-shaped individuals, so to speak. So the way that I've thought about it, because there's also an opportunity to cross-pollinate between the teams, because there are a certain function is represented across multiple teams. And how do you make sure that you are both cross-pollinating within that function across the teams, so that you're capturing the greatest learning and opportunities, as well as ensuring that it then ladders up to what the overall vision and need of and strategy is of the brand. So it's a sort of hard picture to draw, but if you imagine various functions vertically, and each, so, you know, so it could be marketing, it could be access, it could be, I mean, we've spoken about what all of them, it was in that diagram, and there more as the discussion has gone on, including our MedReg legal colleagues. And if you just think about a single function where there might be 5 individuals who work within that function who now deployed to multiple teams, right? So there are 5 different teams. In the team, they should operate in an autonomous way. They have the support of the team. That is where they are decision makers, but they should still be meeting on a somewhat regular basis within the function where the whole opportunity there is to support with expertise, the sharing, the learning, the cross-pollinating, and also to make sure that what everybody is working on is laddering to an overall positive alignment with what the strategy is. And when it isn't happening, it should be called out. I think the sort of last thing that helps facilitate this is when the functional lead of each of these functional leads are also getting together. So it's really, teams within teams, if you will. But that's I think that if you're creating that structure, that's the way for each Agile team to be operating independently and autonomously, but in a way where you're still learning and sharing and laddering up to the overall strategy.
I mean, what I really hear is the opportunity that comes out of Agile is really large, and the benefits are also large, but they are proportional to the investment and commitment you're going to have to make to operate in this way. We're coming to the end of our session. I have a few extra minutes, so maybe I'll ask each one of you to address one of the 2 questions I'm asking now. What advice do you have for marketers or other commercial functions who want to be well positioned in a job market for such an environment? What advice do you give to them? Or do you have advice for leadership executive who wants to start an Agile journey in their organization? What would you give them on their way? So each one of you pick one or the other for a response. We go around. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to start. I give them both the same advice, which is if the goal that you're trying to achieve in kind of modern day engagement with your customers is to actually personalize, is to really go to that kind of end state level of engagement where you really understand the individuals that you serve, such that you're optimizing the treatment choices that they have. The only way that they can do that, the only way you can actually get to personalization is to leverage these types of processes. So the goal should always be front and center, whether you're a leader or whether you're a marketer. If you're intending to get there, the ability to make that kind of rapid adjustments into your engagement models quickly throughout your core channels, you have to do it this way. I can't see another way that would allow it to happen. So that would be the advice I give them.
Maybe if I can bounce from that, Jeff, because I think that you're absolutely centering on this need to be more relevant and more personal for customers and how important it is and what the opportunity is with the Agile team. So maybe the additional piece that I would throw out there is that to do it effectively, it's great to have depth in the skill area that you have, but the real magic happens when you have an appreciation for the roles and the opportunity of bringing, so the roles of each of the cross-functional team members, and that it needs to bring them all together, operating well together to be able to advance and move forward. I think that best positions you for a new job as well as to drive it within an organization.
Chad or Brian?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I would say that for many of us, we read a lot of leadership books and a lot of change management books, and so there's 2 that come to mind for the people who want to be successful sort of moving forward. Number 1, right, the iceberg is melting and somebody is going to move the cheese. You've got 4 leaders from 4 different companies talking really well aligned around this change is happening. And so you have to, 1, recognize it and acknowledge, like, you can either be part of it or be left behind. And to be part of it, that means, as Lisa said, learn the process, understand who does what cross-functionally. I also think that there's lessons to be learned from outside of our industry. Agile is not a new concept. You can Google it. There's a whole concept of agile marketing, along with big A, agile, the ways of working. Outside of our industry, there's companies that have completely shifted to this kind of model that we can take lessons from, real world learnings from companies in the tech space in particular that are operating this way at scale. And as Lisa was describing, sort of that that concept of teams and functions, what comes to mind is there's also consulting companies that work like that, practices and client teams. So these aren't necessarily new concepts. When you recognize that you need to learn something new, there's a lot of avenues out there in which you can learn and be prepared to be part of the change instead of let the change happen to you.
Great. Brian, wrap it up for us, please.
Yeah, so I'm going to maybe wrap up everything I've heard from the other panelists I agree with. I'm going to steal from Nike and say, just do it, right? You just have to jump in and be willing to get uncomfortable, because status quo needs to be challenged. And if we've learned anything from the last 18 months, it's that we are resilient in the challenging of our status quo. And that's exactly what an agile transformation requires. So just do it.
What an inspirational wrap up. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And I think this will not be the last time that we're discussing this topic, as more organizations getting experience. And all eyes are on you, Brian, since you guys are jumping in with both feet and doing it. So thank you so much. And I hope you connect with other people in the platform. There's opportunities to exchange messages and ask each other questions. So take advantage of that if you want to reach out to the panel here. I hope to see you all again soon, hopefully in person. And until next time, thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much.